Billionaire gave 3 black credit cards to test 2 women and his maid. What the maid bought left him speechless. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy the story. I'm done, Arthur. Utterly done. Tony Trump's voice was low and sharp as he tossed a platinum watch onto the polished granite of his penthouse bar. The city lights glittered below, a silent kingdom that felt more like a prison. She didn't ask about my day. She asked if the watch was a limited edition so she could get the hashtag right for her live stream. Am I a person, or am I just an accessory to their brand? Arthur, his impeccably dressed and ever-stoic assistant, calmly placed a glass of whiskey beside him. It was a business dinner, sir. Perhaps her intentions were merely strategic. Strategic. Tony let out a cold laugh, his intense, dark eyes flashing with frustration. She said she admired my portfolio and my bone structure in the same breath. People don't see a man anymore, Arthur. They just see a walking, talking vault. He sank into a leather armchair, the exhaustion of his wealth pressing down on him. Arthur took a breath. Sir, perhaps it's time for a sabbatical. The yacht is ready in Monaco. Fresh air, distance. Tony waved a dismissive hand, a sudden, dangerous energy glittering in his eyes. It was the look he got right before a hostile takeover. No. I'm tired of guessing. I'm tired of playing games with hidden rules. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. So I'm going to invent a game of my own. Arthur's expression remained impassive, but his posture stiffened. I'm afraid to ask, sir. A test, Tony declared. A behavioral study. A stress test of character. Sir, your studies tend to result in lawsuits or hostile media coverage. This time, it'll be clean. I'm going to issue 3 unlimited black credit cards. For 72 hours, 3 women in my life will have absolute financial freedom. No rules, no questions. I won't judge, he said, a cynical smile playing on his lips. I'll just observe. Their choices will tell me everything I need to know. And who are the subjects of this experiment? Isabella, of course, Tony said, gesturing vaguely. She'll turn it into a week-long Instagram story about living your best life. Then, Victoria Sterling. She'll find a way to leverage it into a power play on the stock market. It's all predictable. He paused, looking past Arthur toward the hallway. And then there's the third. Arthur's eyes followed his gaze. So. Rosa. Arthur's composure finally cracked. He looked genuinely surprised. James Rosa? Your maid. Exactly, Tony said, a glint of morbid curiosity in his eyes. The one who has never once made eye contact with me for more than 2 seconds. The one who is so quiet, I sometimes forget she's here. She's the control group, Arthur. A blank slate. I want to see what someone with nothing does when they're given everything. Or how quickly they learn to take advantage, Arthur countered quietly. This is a dangerous game, sir. You're handing them weapons. Tony ignored the warning, already dialing his private banker. The next morning, the black envelopes were ready, arranged on his desk like pieces on a chessboard. He met Victoria in a sterile boardroom. She took the envelope with a cool, analytical gaze. What's the ROI on this gift, Tony? She asked, her mind already at work. Isabella received hers at a rooftop brunch, letting out a theatrical squeal that ensured everyone was watching before she kissed him on the cheek. Finally, he found Rosa. She was in the grand living room, meticulously wiping down a marble console table. Dressed in her crisp black and white uniform, with red gloves protecting her hands, she worked with a silent, focused grace. Rosa, he said, his voice startling her. She turned, and her dark, soulful eyes met his with a direct, questioning look that caught him off guard. She wasn't timid, she was watchful. He held out the envelope. She looked from the envelope to his face, her expression unreadable. Am I being let go, Mr. Trump? Her voice was steady, holding a quiet dignity that felt utterly out of place with her question. No. It's a bonus. A thank you. She slowly removed a glove and took the envelope, opening it with careful fingers. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the black card, but her face betrayed nothing else. Thank you, sir, she said simply, before turning back to her work. Hours later, Tony stood in his office, the whiskey swirling in his glass. Arthur entered, holding a tablet. Sir. The transaction reports are in. Let me guess, Tony said without turning. Isabella chartered a jet to Ibiza, and Victoria made a sizable donation to a senator's re-election campaign. Correct on both counts, sir, Arthur said. Predictable, as you said. And Rosa? Arthur hesitated. Well, sir, that's where it gets interesting. The first charge was for the back rent on a commercial property in the industrial district. The second was for 3 industrial-grade soup kettles. Tony slowly turned from the window, his confident smirk gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and confusion. Soup kettles? The next morning, it continued. Payments to electricians. A bulk order for £5,000 of rice and beans. A down payment on a used delivery van. This wasn't a shopping spree. It was a business operation. He stared at the transaction list, 1,000 cynical theories running through his mind. Was she being scammed? Or was she smarter than he ever imagined? He stood up, grabbing his car keys from the bowl on his desk. Arthur, clear my afternoon. So. I'm going for a drive, Tony said, his dark eyes narrowed. It's time to see what kind of game my quiet maid is really playing. The leather of the steering wheel felt cool and unfamiliar beneath Tony's grip. He rarely drove himself, there were people for that. But this was different. This wasn't a destination, it was an investigation, and he was the only detective he trusted. The purr of the engine was a low growl, a stark contrast to the frantic, unanswered questions ricocheting through his mind. Soup kettles. Delivery vans. He drummed his fingers on the wheel, his dark eyes fixed on the endless stream of traffic flowing away from the heart of the city. Give me the updates, Arthur, he commanded, his voice crisp through the car's integrated speakerphone. There was a soft rustle of paper on the other end. Certainly, sir. Ms. Du Bois has just posted a new series of images from a private villa in Santorini. She is holding a glass of champagne, and the caption reads, Manifesting Abundance. So grateful for the universe's gifts. It has acquired 70,000 likes in the last hour. Tony let out a short, humorless laugh. She's manifesting my abundance. And the universe is conveniently headquartered in my bank account. Pathetic, but predictable. Next. Miss Sterling attended the mayor's annual charity dinner last night, Arthur continued, his tone as dry as a financial report. The society pages are reporting on her spontaneous and deeply moving pledge to finance a new wing for the children's hospital. A pledge made, I might add, just as the city council is set to review the zoning application for her new waterfront development project. Of course, Tony muttered, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. A perfectly leveraged transaction. She didn't spend the money, she invested it in political capital. Cold, brilliant, and exactly what I expected. He navigated the car through an interchange, the gleaming skyscrapers of his world beginning to shrink in the rearview mirror. That's enough of them. I'm tired of being right. Read me Rosa's list again. Every item. From the beginning. Arthur's voice didn't waver. First, a wire transfer to Galloway Commercial Properties LLC for the sum of $120,000, noted as back rent and 1-year lease prepayment. Second, a purchase order from Metro Restaurant Supply for 3 80-gallon steam-jacketed kettles, 2 industrial convection ovens, and 16 stainless steel preparation tables. Tony's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He could picture the items, the cold steel, the sheer scale of it. This wasn't for a home kitchen. This was for an institution. Go on, he commanded. An order from Bulk Provisions Incorporated for £5,000 of long-grain rice, £5,000 of lentils, £2,000 of potatoes, and £1,000 of onions. A payment to the Rivertown Electrical Contractors for commercial-grade rewiring. A down payment on a used, refrigerated Ford Transit van from City Fleet Vehicles. The list went on, each item a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. It was methodical, logical, and completely insane. Arthur finished the list, and a heavy silence filled the car. "Does that paint a clearer picture, sir?" Arthur finally asked, a hint of something unreadable in his voice. "Clear as mud," Tony snapped, ending the call. He spent the rest of the day in his cavernous office, the city a silent, glittering backdrop to his growing obsession. He had Arthur print every invoice, every receipt. He spread them across the vast expanse of his mahogany desk, not like a man reviewing expenses, but like a general mapping out an enemy's strategy. He ignored the blinking lights on his phone, the urgent emails piling up. The multi-billion-dollar Trump empire could run itself for a day. This was more important. This was a deviation in the data, an anomaly in his perfectly cynical worldview, and it was driving him mad. He stared at the documents, his mind, conditioned to see the angle in everything, racing through 1,000 misguided theories. Hypothesis 1, she's a front. This was the most plausible. The quiet, unassuming maid was the perfect cover. Someone, a disgruntled ex-employee, a distant relative with a criminal record, was using her as a pawn, laundering his money through this elaborate setup. He imagined her being coerced, a victim in a larger scheme. It was a neat, tidy explanation that almost satisfied him. Almost. But he remembered the look in her eyes when he'd handed her the card, not fear, but a quiet, watchful intelligence. She didn't look like anyone's victim. Hypothesis 2, the long con. Perhaps she was far more cunning than he'd ever imagined. He pictured her secretly meeting with contractors, inflating the invoices, and pocketing a percentage of every transaction. The soup kitchen was a clever, emotionally manipulative cover for a simple, elegant fraud. This theory appealed to his deep-seated cynicism about human nature. Everyone had a price, and maybe he'd just found hers. It was a disappointingly high price, but the logic was sound. He traced the payment flows, looking for a shell corporation, a hidden account, anything that would prove his suspicion. He found nothing. Every dollar was accounted for, every vendor legitimate. Hypothesis 3, the black market. This was the most outlandish, a theory born of sheer frustration. Maybe this wasn't a charity at all. Maybe it was a front for a massive, illegal catering operation, supplying untraceable food to criminal enterprises. He almost laughed at the image, his quiet maid, James Rosa, in her crisp uniform, secretly a culinary kingpin, the soup queen of the underworld. It was ridiculous, the plot of a B-movie. But in his world of backstabbing rivals and corporate espionage, was it really any more ridiculous than the idea of pure, unadulterated altruism? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He was missing something. There was a variable in the equation he couldn't see. He looked at the neatly printed invoices and then thought of the woman herself. He tried to picture her orchestrating this complex operation, negotiating with commercial real estate agents, sourcing industrial kitchen equipment, managing logistics. The image wouldn't compute. The woman he saw silently gliding through his penthouse, whose presence was as unobtrusive as the air conditioning, seemed utterly incapable of such a grand, ambitious scheme. Perhaps she is simply helping people, Arthur had suggested earlier, his voice deadpan. Tony had scoffed. Nobody is simply anything, Arthur. There is always a motive. Always a return on investment. We just haven't found it yet. But as the hours bled into evening, the certainty in his own words began to fray. Frustration curdled into a raw, undeniable curiosity that gnawed at the edges of his logic. The data was insufficient. The theories were flawed. His perfectly constructed world of predictable greed and strategic self-interest had been shattered by a handful of receipts for soup and beans. He stood abruptly, the sudden movement sending a stack of papers sliding to the floor. He didn't care. He was done with theories. He was done with remote observation. His entire life was built on acquiring hard data, on seeing assets and liabilities with his own eyes. This was no different. He strode out of the office, grabbing the keys to his least conspicuous car, a sleek, black sedan that was still worth more than most people's homes. Arthur met him at the elevator. "Sir? Your dinner reservation with the board is in an hour." "Cancel it," Tony said, not breaking stride. "May I ask where you are going?" Tony paused, his hand on the elevator button. He looked at his loyal assistant, his face a mask of grim determination. "I'm going to see for myself." He left the gleaming steel and glass of his world behind, the GPS on his dashboard guiding him toward a single, inexplicable line item on a receipt, 14B Industrial Way. He was heading into the one place his money had never taken him, into the one territory he could no longer analyze from a distance. He was heading into the unknown. The sleek, black sedan looked like a panther that had wandered into a scrapyard. The streets here weren't paved with smooth asphalt but a patchwork of cracked concrete and faded brick. The gleaming towers of Tony's world were gone, replaced by low-slung buildings with barred windows and graffiti-laced walls. He felt the weight of a dozen stairs as he drove slowly, his car an alien vessel in this gritty, forgotten corner of the city. This wasn't a place you invested in, it was a place you flew over. He found it at the end of the block. 14B Industrial Way. The sign was old, its painted letters peeling from the sun and rain, the neighborhood pantry. It was a humble, unassuming storefront, wedged between a tire shop and a shuttered laundromat. But unlike its neighbors, it was thrumming with life. Through the large front window, Tony could see people moving with purpose, the glint of new stainless steel catching the afternoon light. His soup kettles. For a moment, he just watched from the climate-controlled silence of his car, a spectator observing a foreign habitat. His theories felt thin now, foolish. This was no black market operation. This was something else entirely. Taking a breath that did little to calm the knot in his stomach, he got out of the car and crossed the street. The moment he stepped inside, the warm, fragrant smell of onions and garlic enveloped him. It was a chaotic but organized scene. Volunteers were unpacking boxes of the very produce he'd seen on the invoices, while electricians on ladders worked on the wiring for a massive new oven. "Can I help you?" A woman with kind, wrinkled eyes and a flour-dusted apron approached him. Her smile was warm and genuine. I was just looking," Tony said, feeling utterly out of place. "Here to volunteer?" she asked, mistaking the cut of his expensive suit for a misguided attempt at business casual charity. "We can always use another pair of hands. It's a miracle we're even open. We were days from closing our doors for good. The landlord was going to evict us, and all our equipment was on its last legs. Then, out of nowhere, an angel." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Paid our rent for a whole year. Bought us everything. Everything we ever dreamed of." As she spoke, a figure emerged from a back room, and Tony's breath caught in his throat. It was Rosa. But it was also not Rosa. She wasn't in her starched black and white uniform. She wore faded jeans, a simple grey sweater with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and her hair was pulled back in a messy, practical bun. Without the uniform, she looked younger, more vibrant. The serious, downcast expression he was used to was gone, replaced by a warm, focused energy. She was no longer a shadow gliding through his hallways, here, she was the center of gravity. "Maria, the plumbers need to know where the new sink goes," she said, her voice clear and confident. She was holding a clipboard, pointing to a set of blueprints. She wasn't asking for permission, she was in charge. Then she saw him. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, a look of pure shock, and something akin to horror, flashed across her face. The clipboard fell to her side. "Mr. Trump," she whispered, the name sounding foreign in this place. Tony felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn to him. The billionaire. The landlord. The enemy. He didn't know which role they saw him in, but he knew he didn't belong. He was speechless, his mind blank, all his carefully constructed theories incinerated by the simple, undeniable reality in front of him. To his own surprise, he heard himself say the only thing he could think of. "I came to help." Maria's eyes lit up. "Oh, wonderful. We're desperately behind on the dishes from the morning service." Before he could protest, she was leading him toward a cavernous back kitchen where a mountain of greasy pots and pans sat waiting. "Here you are," she said cheerfully. "The gloves are over there." He stood there for a moment, staring at the industrial-sized sink. Tony Trump, who hadn't washed his own coffee cup in 15 years, was about to scrub pots. He saw Rosa watching him from the doorway, a complex emotion on her face, a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and the faintest hint of amusement. Defiantly, he pulled on a pair of bright yellow rubber gloves and turned on the faucet. It was a humbling masterclass in his own uselessness. The water pressure was ferocious, soaking the front of his $1,000 suit. The industrial soap was harsh, and the caked-on food refused to budge. He was slow, clumsy, and utterly inept. After a few minutes of his flailing, Rosa walked over and quietly took the scrubber from his hand. "You have to let them soak first," she said, her voice soft. She worked with an efficient, practiced rhythm, her movements sure and steady. He just stood there, dripping and useless, watching her. A small, genuine smile finally touched her lips. "You're better at signing checks than scrubbing pans, Mr. Trump." They worked in a strange, companionable silence for a while. The barrier between them, boss and maid, billionaire and mystery, had been washed away by soapy water and his own incompetence. Finally, he had to ask. "Why?" he said, his voice lower than he intended. "Why this?" She stopped scrubbing and turned to face him, her dark eyes direct and honest, holding his gaze without flinching. "Because I know what it's like to be hungry, Mr. Trump." The words were simple, delivered without a trace of self-pity, and they hit him with the force of a physical blow. He suddenly saw it all, the story she wasn't telling, the childhood hardship that had forged the quiet, resilient woman standing before him. This wasn't a scheme. It wasn't a strategy. It was a memory. In that moment, standing in a humble kitchen that smelled of bleach and onions, the full weight of his cheap, cynical game came crashing down on him. He had treated her character as a commodity to be tested, a data point in his arrogant experiment. But her life, her struggles, her profound generosity, they weren't a game. They were real. And for the first time in a very long time, Tony Trump felt a deep and searing shame. The penthouse was silent. It had always been silent, but now the silence felt different. It was no longer a symbol of peace and order, it was a vast, echoing emptiness. Tony stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, but he wasn't seeing the glittering city below. He was seeing a cramped kitchen, steam rising from an industrial sink, and a worn-down linoleum floor. He was haunted by the image of Rosa. Not the quiet, deferential maid who moved like a ghost through his home, but the woman in the faded jeans and messy bun, confidently directing volunteers, her face lit with a purpose he'd never seen in anyone. He replayed the moment she had smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips, as he stood there, dripping and useless. In his world, smiles were currency, weapons, or masks. Hers had simply been a smile. The contrast between her reality of genuine need and his of manufactured desire was a jarring dissonance that left him feeling profoundly hollow. The next morning, he found her in the library, dusting the leather-bound books he had never read. She was back in her crisp uniform, a ghost once more. The vibrant, capable woman from the pantry was gone, replaced by the quiet, efficient employee. He watched her for a moment, the chasm between their two lives feeling both impossibly wide and absurdly thin. "Rosa," he said. She turned, her expression neutral, her hand still. "Yes, Mr. Trump." His name on her lips sounded formal, correct, and suddenly unbearable. He felt a surge of something unfamiliar, a nervousness. "I was wondering," he began, his voice sounding stiff even to his own ears, "if you would have coffee with me this afternoon." She blinked, her composure faltering for just a second. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. It was the same look of suspicion he saw in every boardroom. "Coffee, sir." "Not as Mr. Trump," he clarified, stepping forward. "As Tony." "Just coffee. To talk." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. He could see the calculations whirring behind her eyes, the ingrained caution of someone for whom a simple invitation from a man like him could never be simple. But then, to his surprise, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Tony." He chose a small, unassuming cafe in a part of town he'd never been to, a place with mismatched chairs and the warm, comforting smell of roasted coffee beans. It was the kind of place Isabella wouldn't be caught dead in. When Rosa arrived, she was wearing a simple dress, her hair down. She looked beautiful, and for the first time, Tony felt the full, unnerving force of his attraction to her. The initial awkwardness was thick between them. He, the man who commanded boardrooms with an iron will, found himself struggling to make small talk. She, the woman who had faced down eviction and poverty, seemed equally out of her depth. But as they talked, the walls began to crumble. He was mesmerized by her. He discovered the sharp intelligence in her observations, the quiet, dry wit that flickered in her smile. She spoke of her life, not as a tragedy, but as a series of facts. She talked about growing up with little, about the responsibility she felt for her community, and about the simple, profound joy of seeing a family get a hot meal. There was no self-pity in her voice, only a strength that humbled him. Emboldened by her honesty, he found himself confessing things he hadn't even admitted to Arthur. He spoke of the crushing loneliness of his wealth, the suffocating paranoia that came with never knowing who to trust. He described his life as a gilded cage, where every relationship was a transaction and every kindness a potential prelude to a request. She listened intently, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She didn't offer cheap pity or easy reassurances. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee. Then she looked up at him, and with a simple, devastating accuracy, she summarized his entire existence. "It must be hard," she said softly, "to know if people see you, or just what you can do for them." He stared at her, speechless. He had built his empire on that cynical truth, wielded it like a shield to keep the world at bay. But hearing it from her, spoken with such quiet empathy, it sounded less like a bitter truth and more like a profound sorrow. She didn't judge him for it. She understood it. He drove her home as the sun began to set, the silence in the car no longer awkward, but comfortable. He pulled up a block from her apartment building, as she'd requested. He didn't want the moment to end. He realized, with a jolt, that in the 2 hours they had spent in that simple cafe, he had felt more like himself than he had in the last decade. "Thank you, Tony," she said, her hand on the door handle. "For the coffee." "Thank you," he replied, his voice rough. "For the conversation." He watched her walk away, a small figure disappearing into the anonymity of the city. He had irrevocably crossed a line, broken the unspoken rules that governed his life. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't regret it. He felt the terrifying, exhilarating flutter of a fragile, new beginning. In the rarefied air of the city's elite, secrets were a currency more valuable than gold, and gossip was the stock exchange on which they were traded. The news of Tony Trump and his maid didn't break like a tidal wave, it seeped into the foundations of their world like a slow, toxic poison. It began, as it often did, with a blurry photograph. A text message delivered to Isabella Dubois's phone as she was selecting a diamond bracelet at Cartier. The image was grainy, taken from across the street, showing Tony and a plainly dressed woman with dark hair sharing coffee at an utterly unremarkable cafe. The text was simple, a stiletto wrapped in velvet. "Isn't that your Tony? Who is she? She looks so normal." Isabella's perfectly manicured hand froze over the display case. Normal. The word was an insult, a social disease. She stared at the image, her mind struggling to process the scene. It wasn't just that he was with another woman. It was the kind of woman. There were no designer clothes, no strategic lighting, no performance for an unseen audience. It was intimate in its sheer simplicity. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, coiled in her stomach. This wasn't a rival. This was a rebellion. She felt the hot sting of public humiliation, the terrifying thought that he hadn't just replaced her, he had downgraded. The world she had so carefully constructed, a world where she was the glittering prize, had been cheapened by a woman who looked like she shopped at a department store. Miles away, in a sterile, glass-walled corner office overlooking the financial district, Victoria Sterling received the news differently. It wasn't a gossip-laced text, but a casual remark from a business associate during a conference call. "Heard your friend Tony's gone domestic," the man had chuckled. "Investing in some local charity project with his housekeeper, of all people." Victoria's glacial composure didn't crack. She finished the call with ruthless efficiency, but after she hung up, she stared out at the city, her sharp features hardening into a mask of contempt. This wasn't a personal affront, it was a strategic blunder. Tony Trump, a man whose every move was usually a calculated play for power, was allowing himself to be swayed by sentiment. The woman, this housekeeper, offered no value. She had no connections, no influence, no assets to be leveraged. She was a rounding error in the grand balance sheet of their world. To Victoria, Tony's interest in her wasn't romantic, it was a sign of weakness, an illogical deviation that threatened the predictable order of things. And weakness, in her world, was a liability that had to be managed. Hey there! Have you subscribed to my channel? If not, please do, and also comment on what you have learnt so far. Let's continue. 2 days later, they met for lunch at Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign. The air was thick with the scent of money and hushed ambition. Isabella, dressed in a vibrant red that screamed defiance, was the one who had called the meeting. Victoria arrived in a severe, tailored grey suit, an apex predator in her natural habitat. "Can you believe the utter audacity?" Isabella began, her voice a brittle whisper as soon as the waiter had departed. "To be seen so publicly with the help. It's a slap in the face. To me. To our entire circle." Victoria delicately placed her napkin on her lap, her eyes cold and analytical. "It's not audacity, Isabella. It's a temporary lapse in judgment. He's indulging in a sentimental pet project. This woman is a novelty to him." "A novelty?" Isabella scoffed, swirling the wine in her glass. "He gave her a black card. I had my sources check. A black card with no limit. The same one he gave us." That information landed with a heavy thud between them. It was one thing for him to be charitable. It was another entirely for him to place the maid on their level. "She's so plain," Isabella continued, the venom finally seeping through her polished veneer. "I saw her once in the penthouse. Barely even looked up. Now she's having coffee with him and saving the world with his money. Please. It's an act. It has to be." "Of course, it's an act," Victoria agreed, though for different reasons. She didn't believe in selfless acts, only in well-disguised motives. No one is that pure. She found his weakness, his recent obsession with authenticity, and she is exploiting it. Brilliantly, I'll admit. The damsel in distress, the humble servant with a heart of gold. It's the oldest trick in the book. They sat in silence for a moment, a strange, cruel partnership forming in the space between them. They were not friends. They were competitors, two lionesses who had long circled the same territory. But now, they had a common pest, an anomaly that threatened the ecosystem they both thrived in. "He needs to be reminded of who he is," Isabella said, her voice low and determined. "And who he belongs with. He needs to be protected from his own poor judgment," Victoria corrected, her tone clinical. "This woman is a liability. A sentimental investment with no return. We would be doing him a favor by liquidating the asset." A slow, cold smile spread across Isabella's face. "What do you have in mind?" This was Victoria's domain. Strategy. Takedowns. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, weaving a narrative of pure, calculated poison. "We can't attack the charity. That would make us look petty and cruel. The media loves a story about saving the poor. No, we don't attack the act. We attack the actor. She laid out the plan with the precision of a surgeon. We frame her. We create a narrative that she isn't a saint, she's a cunning manipulator. We suggest that the funds aren't just for charity, but are being funneled to her own friends and family. We hint at inflated costs, at a lack of official oversight. We turn her from a hero into a thief who is preying on the generosity of a naive billionaire. Isabella's eyes lit up, the thrill of the scheme overriding any lingering morality. Anonymous sources, she breathed. Insiders who are concerned for Tony. Exactly, Victoria confirmed. We don't need hard proof. We just need to plant the seed of doubt. In his world, doubt is a far more potent poison than any fact. She took a sip of her water. You have the social connections. You know the right channels, the right people who are hungry for a story that tears someone down. I know just the person, Isabella said, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. She thought of Marcus Thorne, a gossip columnist whose career was built on the ruins of reputations. He was vicious, immoral, and, most importantly, widely read. He'll do it for the price of the exclusive. The trap was designed. The bait was chosen. All that was left was to spring it. That evening, from the sleek comfort of Victoria's office, the plan was put into motion. A single, encrypted email was sent to Marcus Thorne, containing a carefully curated collection of half-truths, fabricated concerns, and leading questions. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, designed to be untraceable and utterly devastating. When it was done, Victoria poured 2 glasses of vintage champagne. She handed one to Isabella, the crystal flute cold and elegant in her hand. To restoring order, Victoria said, her voice as smooth as ice. Isabella smiled, her red lipstick a slash of victory. To putting the help back in her place. They clinked their glasses, the clear, sharp sound echoing in the silent office. The poison had been administered. The trap was set. And in their world, the maid never, ever won. The story didn't just break, it detonated. It landed on the city's most voracious gossip website at dawn and spread like a digital wildfire. The headline was a masterpiece of cruel, effective character assassination, designed for maximum clicks and righteous indignation. Trump's maid or master manipulator. Billionaire's pet project exposed as family/fund. The article beneath was a venomous tapestry woven from half-truths and insidious innuendo. It didn't need facts, it had sources. Anonymous insiders close to the Trump empire expressed their deep concern for the billionaire's recent vulnerability. Concerned friends worried he was being taken advantage of by a woman with a sob story. Vague references were made to inflated invoices and an unregistered charity, painting a picture of a cunning operator who had weaponized her poverty to defraud a naive benefactor. It was a perfect narrative, preying on every cynical stereotype about the poor and the rich. By the time Tony stormed into his home office, the crisis was in full bloom. His head of PR was pacing, his chief legal counsel was on the phone, and Arthur stood grimly by the window, a tablet in hand. The room was a command center, a war room designed to mitigate damage and control narratives. Tony was in his element, barking orders, his mind already calculating 3 moves ahead. The office door opened without a knock. Rosa stood in the doorway, a stark, quiet contrast to the corporate chaos. Her face was pale, but her posture was ramrod straight, her dignity an invisible shield. She held her phone in one hand, and he noticed it was trembling slightly. Her dark, soulful eyes, which had looked at him with such warmth in that little cafe, were now filled with a cold, clear shock. The frantic energy in the room died. His team fell silent, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer a PR problem. She took 3 steps into the room, her gaze locked on his. She didn't look at the lawyers or the publicists. She looked only at him. "You know this isn't true," she said. Her voice was low but perfectly clear, cutting through the tension in the room. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a final, desperate appeal to the man she thought she had met, the man who had confessed his own loneliness to her. For a split second, that man existed. A hot surge of protective fury rose in Tony's chest. He wanted to burn down the world for putting that look on her face. He opened his mouth to say it, to unleash his army of lawyers on the people who had dared to touch her. But then, a lifetime of conditioning took over. The cynical armor he had worn for decades snapped back into place. The CEO took over from the man. The problem was no longer a wound to be healed, but a threat to be neutralized. "Rosa, I know," he said, his voice clipped and impersonal, the same tone he used in a hostile negotiation. "But we have to be smart about this. We can't just react. We have to be strategic." He turned to his team, a general addressing his troops. "I want a full, independent audit of every expense, every transaction. I want it done by noon tomorrow. We need to have all the facts, irrefutable and verified, before we issue a formal response." The word hung in the air between them, cold and heavy as steel. "Audit." He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tremor that ran through her body. The light in her eyes, the fragile trust she had so cautiously extended to him, went out. It was as if he had slammed a door in her face, confirming every doubt she had ever had about him, about his world, about her place in it. He had just failed her in the most absolute way possible. Her face, which had been pale with shock, settled into a mask of profound, quiet disappointment. It was a look far more devastating than any rage or tears. "You still need proof," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The trembling in her hand was gone. "After everything." He wanted to say something, to take it back, but the corporate machine was already in motion, and he was at its controls. The words wouldn't come. She simply nodded, a small, final gesture of understanding. She turned and walked out of the office, her back as straight as a soldier's. A minute later, she returned. She walked to the large armchair where he sometimes left his jacket and placed a neatly folded pile of black and white fabric on it, her uniform. "I can't work for someone who doesn't trust me," she said, her voice steady and clear. And then she was gone. The office door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. The frantic energy of the war room had vanished, replaced by a cold, heavy void. His PR head started to speak, but Tony raised a hand to silence him. He walked over to the armchair and stared down at the empty uniform. It was a symbol of her role, of the box he had put her in, and the one he had, in the end, refused to let her out of. He had been given a chance to believe in something real, and he had chosen to audit it instead. The biggest mistake of his life wasn't a bad investment or a failed merger. It was standing right here, in a neat, folded pile of fabric. The silence in the penthouse was a physical presence. It was heavier than the marble countertops, colder than the steel fixtures, and more expansive than the panoramic view of the city. After Rosa left, the place had reverted to what it had been before she came, a structure, not a home. Now, it felt like a tomb, a monument to his colossal failure. Tony stood in the center of the living room, staring at the neatly folded uniform on the armchair. It was an indictment. Every polished surface, every dust-free corner that had once been a testament to her diligence now felt like a personal accusation. He had built an empire on the principles of logic, strategy, and the cold, hard data of human self-interest. He had created a test to prove that worldview correct, and he had succeeded with 2 of his subjects. But with the third, the only one who mattered, he had become the subject of a different kind of test. And he had failed. He replayed their final conversation in his mind, the memory a self-inflicted wound. He heard his own voice, clipped and impersonal, defaulting to corporate damage control. "We need to have all the facts." The words were a coward's shield, the cold logic of his business world chosen over the simple, fragile faith she had offered him. He had looked at the most genuine person he had ever met and demanded she prove her worth on a spreadsheet. A wave of self-loathing, so potent it was nauseating, washed over him. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down, suffocating him. He walked to the bar and poured a whiskey, but the amber liquid held no comfort. He saw her face in the reflection of the glass, the quiet disappointment that had shattered him more than any outburst of anger ever could have. He slammed the glass down, the sound cracking the oppressive silence. The paralysis of guilt receded, replaced by something else, a cold, focused fury. The sadness was gone, burned away by the heat of a new, singular purpose. He strode into his office and pressed the intercom. "Arthur! In here! Now!" When his assistant entered, he found Tony standing with his back to him, staring out at the city. He didn't turn around. "Find them," Tony said, his voice like ice. It was devoid of the frustration from his earlier rants, stripped of all emotion save for a chilling, absolute resolve. "Find the people who did this to her. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who you have to burn. Uncover everything. I want names, dates, and proof." He finally turned, and the look in his eyes made Arthur take an involuntary step back. "Burn whatever bridges you have to." The machine that was Trump Industries, a behemoth usually aimed at acquiring assets and crushing competitors, pivoted with ruthless efficiency. The full force of Tony's empire was unleashed not on a corporation, but on a lie. His cybersecurity team, normally tasked with protecting against billion-dollar hacks, dissected digital footprints and traced encrypted messages. His private investigators, usually digging up dirt on rival CEOs, followed the faintest whispers through the city's elite social circles. It didn't take long. The conspiracy, woven with the arrogance of the untouchable, unraveled with astonishing speed. 48 hours later, Arthur placed a thin manila folder on Tony's desk. It contained no corporate reports or stock analyses. It contained the complete anatomy of a betrayal, copies of encrypted texts between Isabella and Victoria, financial records showing a discreet payment to the gossip columnist, and a sworn affidavit from a terrified junior editor who had been ordered to plant the story. The proof was absolute, damning, and irrefutable. Tony stared at the file, his jaw tight. The old Tony, the man from 3 days ago, would have relished this moment. He would have called his lawyers, scheduled a press conference, and systematically dismantled the lives of the 2 women who had crossed him. He would have turned their worlds to ash and called it justice. He pictured the headlines, the public humiliation of Isabella and Victoria, the triumphant vindication of his power. But the image felt hollow, a Pyrrhic victory that won him nothing of value. Vengeance was a currency he no longer traded in. Destroying them wouldn't break the trust he had shattered. It wouldn't erase the look of disappointment from Rosa's eyes. He stood and walked to the window. Clearing her name was a simple matter of logistics. He could do that with a single phone call. But the real damage wasn't to her public reputation, it was the private wound he himself had inflicted. A press release issued from his glass tower, a statement from a faceless PR firm, it was all part of the cold, impersonal world that had failed her in the first place. Redemption wouldn't be found here, in his world of power and control. It had to be found in hers. He couldn't summon her back to his kingdom. He had to abdicate his throne, walk into her territory, and prove, without the armor of his wealth or the shield of his lawyers, that he had changed. The neighborhood pantry was a symphony of organized chaos. The clatter of plates, the murmur of 100 conversations, the warm, savory steam rising from the serving line, it was the sound of a community being fed, a world away from the sterile silence of Tony's penthouse. And into that world, he walked. He was an alien, a creature from another planet. His expensive, hand-tailored suit was a glaring anomaly in the sea of worn jeans and simple work clothes. The hum of conversation faltered as he stepped through the door. Heads turned. Forks paused mid-air. The entire room seemed to hold a collective breath as they took in the intruder. He was not just an outsider, he was the man from the newspapers, the billionaire at the center of the storm that had threatened to engulf their quiet hero. He saw her immediately. She was behind the long stainless steel serving line, a ladle in her hand, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a plain white apron over a faded t-shirt. When her eyes met his, her hand froze. Her face, which had been animated as she spoke to the person in front of her, became a blank, unreadable mask. Her body stiffened, her posture becoming a silent wall of defense. He had trespassed. He had brought his toxic world into her sanctuary. Ignoring the whispers that rippled through the crowd, ignoring the hostile glares, he walked to the center of the dining hall. He felt more exposed, more vulnerable than he had ever felt in a hostile boardroom. He held up a hand, not in a gesture of command, but of quiet supplication. "Excuse me," he began, and was startled by how unsteady his own voice sounded. "Could I have your attention, please? For just a moment." The room fell into a tense, expectant silence. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at Rosa. "My name is Tony Trump," he said, the name feeling like a confession. "And I owe someone in this room, and all of you, an apology." He took a deep, shuddering breath. A few days ago, a story was published that called Rosa Williams a manipulator. It called this place a fraud. A low, angry murmur went through the room. That story was a lie, Tony continued, his voice growing stronger, clearer. It was a calculated, vicious lie, fabricated by people who were threatened by her goodness. "I have the proof, and I will make it public. Her name will be cleared." He paused, his gaze never leaving her face. "But that's not why I'm here." His voice cracked, the raw emotion he'd been suppressing finally breaking through. "The papers called Rosa a manipulator, but the real fraud in this story was me." The confession hung in the air, stunning the room into absolute silence. "I live in a world of wealth, but I was poor in faith. I was poor in trust. I failed to trust the most honest, decent person I have ever known." He was speaking only to her now, the rest of the world fading away. "I looked at an act of pure kindness, and I demanded to see the receipts. I broke her heart because I was too cynical, too broken myself, to believe that someone could just be good." His voice dropped, thick with a regret that was almost suffocating. "And for that, Rosa, I am truly, deeply sorry." He saw the tears then. They weren't loud or dramatic, just silent tracks cutting paths down her pale cheeks. She stood frozen, the ladle still in her hand, her defenses finally, completely shattered by the raw, humbling force of his public contrition. He took a slow step toward the serving line, then another, stopping a respectful few feet away, a chasm of his own making still between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said softly, his voice for her alone now. "I don't deserve it. But I had to tell you, and these people, your people, the truth." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Maria, the elderly woman from his first visit, walked over to Rosa and placed a gentle hand on her arm, whispering something in her ear. Rosa closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering all the strength she had left. When she opened them, she looked at him, and he saw not just the hurt, but the flicker of the woman he had shared coffee with, the woman who had understood his loneliness. She put down the ladle. Wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, she walked around the serving line and closed the distance between them. She stopped just before him, her dark eyes searching his, looking for the man behind the desperate, public apology. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Tony," she whispered, her voice rough with unshed tears. "Even idiots." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He had been given a reprieve. A fragile, unearned chance to rebuild. And as he stood there, face to face with the woman he had almost lost, the community she had saved, her people, erupted in a wave of supportive, heartfelt applause. It wasn't for the billionaire. It was for the act of forgiveness, for the hope of a new beginning, a fragile bridge being built in the heart of their pantry. 1 year later, the sound was not the clinking of champagne glasses in a sterile boardroom, but the scrape of a silver shovel hitting hard-packed earth. The air didn't smell of expensive perfume, but of damp soil and new beginnings. This was the groundbreaking ceremony for the third location of the Pantry Foundation, a city-wide network of community kitchens that was rapidly becoming a beacon of hope in the city's forgotten neighborhoods. Tony stood in the crowd, a face among many, his hands in the pockets of a simple tweed jacket. He was not on the stage. The stage belonged to Rosa. She stood at the podium, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair pulled back in a graceful knot. The hesitant, watchful woman he had first met was gone, replaced by a leader who spoke with a quiet, unshakable confidence. She wasn't loud or performative. She commanded the attention of the crowd, a mix of city officials, volunteers, and local residents, with the sheer force of her sincerity. A hot meal is not just about food, she was saying, her voice clear and steady. It's about dignity. It's a message that says, you are not invisible. You are part of a community that cares. That is the foundation we are building here today. An unfamiliar sense of pride swelled in Tony's chest, so potent it almost ached. He wasn't proud of the money that had made this possible. He was proud of her. He was proud of the woman who had taken a cynical test and turned it into a movement, who had taken his empty fortune and filled it with purpose. The world they had both left behind had, in the meantime, consumed its own. The story of the conspiracy, which Tony had released with cold, surgical precision, had been devastating. Isabella's social media empire crumbled under the weight of public scorn, turning her into a pariah in the very circles she had tried so desperately to rule. Victoria's reputation for ruthless strategy curdled into one of immoral treachery, and a major corporate deal she had been orchestrating collapsed spectacularly. They were relics of a past life, footnotes in a story that was no longer about them. Tony's own transformation was less public but more profound. The cynical armor had fallen away, piece by piece. He still ran his empire, but the work was no longer the sole definition of his existence. He had traded his isolation for connection, his paranoia for purpose. He was happier, more fulfilled, than he had ever been when his only goal was to acquire more. After the ceremony, Rosa walked down from the stage, her face glowing. She found him in the crowd, and her smile was just for him. He reached out and squeezed her hand, a simple gesture of shared victory. "You were incredible," he murmured. "We were," she corrected softly, her eyes full of a love that still, after all this time, left him breathless. That evening, the penthouse was no longer a cold, sterile showcase. It was warm, lived in. Soft light pooled on a stack of books by the fireplace. The faint scent of rosemary and garlic hung in the air. In the kitchen, Tony was clumsily chopping vegetables while Rosa stirred a pot on the stove. It had become their ritual, a simple act of partnership that grounded them. He watched her, the woman whose quiet dignity had shattered his world only to rebuild it into something infinitely better. She was humming, slightly off-key, and the sound was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. "You know," he said, pausing his attack on a defenseless carrot. He took her free hand, turning her to face him. "That black card was the best investment I ever made." Rosa looked up at him, her dark eyes full of love and a familiar, playful mischief. A slow smile spread across her face. "Good," she said, her voice a low, teasing whisper. "Because the Foundation's 5-year expansion plan is going to need a few more of them." He burst out laughing, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the room. He pulled her close, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her body, the feeling of being truly home overwhelming him. He kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss filled with a quiet certainty of their future. They had started as a billionaire and a maid, two people on opposite sides of a vast, lonely chasm. But here, in the heart of the empire he had built, they were equals, partners, building something far more valuable together. Their new empire wasn't measured in stock prices or square footage, but in shared laughter, second chances, and the unconditional love that had grown from a simple, extraordinary act of trust. What did you think of Tony and Rosa's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know what score you would give it on a scale from 0 to 10. If you enjoyed their journey from suspicion to love, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss another one of our emotional stories. And don't forget to check out another powerful story right here.